That ticket is fake and you know it. Get off this plane before I have you arrested for fraud." The words sliced through the cabin air like a blade sharp enough to make every passenger in first class freeze mid-conversation. Victoria Hayes stood in the narrow aisle of Skyline Airways Flight 447, her perfectly manicured finger pointing directly at the young black woman seated in 2B. Victoria's blonde hair was pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it seemed to stretch her pale skin, and her navy blue uniform was pressed to crisp perfection. But it was her eyes that told the real story, cold blue chips of ice that had already judged, convicted, and sentenced the woman in front of her. The target of Victoria's accusation was Amara Collins, 28 years old, sitting calmly with her hands folded in her lap. She wore faded jeans, a gray hoodie with a university logo, and white sneakers that had seen better days. Her curly hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and a worn canvas backpack sat tucked beneath the seat in front of her. To anyone looking, she appeared to be exactly what Victoria assumed a college student who had somehow stumbled into first class by mistake, or worse, by fraud. What Victoria didn't know, what none of the 180 passengers on Flight 447 knew, was that Amara Collins was a senior safety inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration. She carried a gold badge in her wallet and federal authority that could ground planes, shut down airlines, and end careers with a single report. But more importantly, she was here on purpose. For the past 6 months, the FAA had been receiving complaints about Skyline Airways. Not about mechanical failures or safety violations, but about something far more insidious. Passengers, specifically passengers of color, reported being harassed, questioned, and removed from premium cabin seats. The complaints painted a picture of flight attendants who saw themselves as gatekeepers protecting first class from people who in their minds didn't belong. Amara had read every complaint, studied every incident report, and watched every piece of cell phone footage that passengers had submitted. But complaints and videos weren't enough. She needed to see it herself, experience it firsthand, document it with federal authority. So she had booked this flight under her own name, used her personal credit card, and dressed down to blend in. She was fishing, and Victoria Hayes had just taken the bait with both hands. "Ma'am," Amara said quietly, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who had faced far worse situations, "I've already shown you my ticket and my identification. Both are valid." Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, I've seen your ticket, sweetheart. And I've seen tickets like it before. People print them at home thinking they can fool us." "Well, not on my flight." She turned to address the other passengers, her voice rising with theatrical authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay, but we have a security situation that needs to be resolved before we can depart." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted like air pressure before a storm. Conversations stopped. Phones came out. All eyes turned to row 2. In seat 1, a David Thompson, a business executive in an expensive gray suit, shifted uncomfortably. He flew over 200,000 miles per year and had seen his share of airline drama, but something about this felt different. Wrong. 3 rows back, Sarah Martinez, a travel blogger in her late 20s, had already pulled out her phone. She had 50,000 followers on social media and an instinct for content that would resonate. This looked like it was going to be a story worth telling. Standing near the galley, Jennifer Walsh, the second flight attendant, watched with the expression of someone who had seen this performance before. At 52, Jennifer had worked alongside Victoria for 8 years, and she knew the routine. Victoria would escalate, create drama, and Jennifer would nod along supportively, because that's what kept the peace in the crew quarters. From the cockpit doorway, Carlos Rivera, the co-pilot, had emerged to see what the commotion was about. At 35, he had been flying for 12 years and prided himself on maintaining professionalism. But as he watched Victoria's theatrical display, something in his gut told him this was about to go very wrong. Miss Victoria continued, her voice dripping with false concern. "I understand you might be confused about airline policies, but first class is for passengers who have actually purchased first-class tickets. Not for people who think they can scam their way into a better seat. Amara felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with being talked down to, but her expression remained neutral. She had trained for this moment, prepared for exactly this kind of encounter. Her job was to observe, document, and remain professional. But as Victoria's words grew more pointed, more publicly, humiliating, Amara felt the weight of every complaint she had read, every story of passengers who had been made to feel less than human. "I purchased this ticket legally," Amara said, her voice steady. "If you would like to verify it through your system, I'm happy to wait." Victoria's smile grew colder. "Oh, I don't need to check any system. I know a fraud when I see one." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and every passenger in that cabin understood exactly what Victoria meant. This wasn't about tickets or systems or airline policy. This was about something much deeper, much uglier, and much more dangerous for everyone involved. Because in Seat 2B, Amara Collins was no longer just observing discrimination. She was experiencing it. And as a federal inspector with the full authority of the United States government behind her, she was about to make very sure that this would be the last time Victoria Hayes ever made another passenger feel this way. But first, she would let Victoria dig her hole a little deeper. Victoria Hayes had been a flight attendant for 18 years, and in her mind, that made her the undisputed queen of any aircraft she stepped onto. She had started her career believing she was providing hospitality, but somewhere along the way, hospitality had transformed into authority. She no longer saw herself as serving passengers. She saw herself as protecting the airline from passengers who didn't deserve what they were trying to take. And the woman in 2B Victoria was trying to take something that didn't belong to her. "Ma'am, I need to see that ticket again," Victoria announced, loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. She held out her hand with the expectation of immediate compliance. "And this time I need to examine it properly." Amara reached into her backpack and withdrew the boarding pass, handing it over without argument. Victoria snatched it with more force than necessary and held it up to the overhead light as if she were examining a counterfeit bill. She turned it over, studied the barcode, and made a show of looking confused. "This is very strange," Victoria said, speaking to the cabin rather than to Amara. "The paper quality seems off. And the printing looks amateur." From 3 rows back, Sarah Martinez had switched her phone to video mode and was capturing every word. Her fingers flew across the screen as she started a live stream, typing quickly, "Flight attendant accusing passenger of ticket fraud." "This is getting intense." #Skyline shame. Within seconds, viewers began joining the stream. 10, then 50, then 200. Comments started flowing. "Why is she being so aggressive? That ticket looks fine to me." "This is discrimination, plain and simple." David Thompson in 1. A cleared his throat. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help but notice that the ticket appears identical to mine. Same paper, same printing, same format." He held up his own boarding pass for comparison. Victoria's head snapped toward him, her customer service smile stretching thin. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but I'm trained to identify fraudulent documents. This young lady's ticket has several red flags that you wouldn't notice unless you knew what to look for," such as David pressed his corporate lawyer instincts kicking in. Victoria faltered for just a moment, then recovered. "Well, the seat assignment seems suspicious for someone of her demographic." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of discomfort throughout the cabin. Several passengers shifted in their seats. Phones came out. The energy changed from curious to tense. Jennifer Walsh stepped forward from the galley, sensing that Victoria needed backup. "We've had a lot of problems lately with people upgrading themselves illegally," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone confirming an established fact. "It's a growing trend, and we have to be vigilant." Amara looked up at both flight attendants, her expression still calm, but her eyes showing the first hint of steel. Are you suggesting that I illegally upgraded myself? I'm not suggesting anything, Victoria replied with false innocence. I'm simply following our security protocols when dealing with questionable documentation. Questionable how exactly, Amara asked. Victoria's smile became razor sharp. Well, for starters, first-class tickets are expensive. Very expensive. And looking at you, she gestured vaguely at Amara's casual clothing, her worn backpack, her youth. It just doesn't add up. People in first class usually look the part. Sarah's live stream was now approaching 1,000 viewers, and the comments were becoming a flood. Did she just say, people in first class look the part? This is 2024, not 1954. Someone needs to record this for evidence. Where's the captain? Carlos Rivera stepped closer, his pilot's instincts telling him this situation was escalating beyond normal passenger service issues. Victoria, maybe we should handle this quietly. We're already running late for departure. Victoria turned on him with surprising venom. Carlos, I don't tell you how to fly the plane. Don't tell me how to handle security issues. This is exactly the kind of situation that corporate has trained us to watch for. Security issues. Amara repeated, her voice still controlled, but with an edge creeping in. Because I'm a young black woman in first class, race has nothing to do with this, Victoria snapped, but her face was flushing red. This is about fraud prevention, pure and simple. Then check your system, Amara said. Look up the ticket purchase. Verify the payment method. Do what you claim you're trained to do instead of making assumptions based on how I look. Victoria's jaw tightened. In 18 years of flying, she had never had a passenger challenge her authority so directly, so calmly. Most people, when confronted with her accusations, became flustered, angry, or defensive. This woman was doing none of those things, and it was making Victoria even more suspicious. I don't need to check anything, Victoria declared. I can spot a fraud from across the cabin, and that's what this is. She waved the boarding pass in the air like evidence in a trial. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you all to know that Skyline Airways takes security very seriously. We will not allow anyone to board our aircraft with fraudulent documents, no matter how authentic they might appear. The cabin had gone dead silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning and the soft pings of phone notifications as more passengers began recording and posting. Gate agents could be seen through the windows wondering why the flight hadn't pushed back yet. Michael Anderson, the gate supervisor, appeared at the aircraft door. He was a thin man in his 40s with premature gray hair and the permanently harried expression of someone who spent his days solving problems he didn't create. What's the delay, he called out. Victoria's voice carried clearly to the front of the plane. We have a passenger with fraudulent documentation who is refusing to leave the aircraft. Michael's face went pale. Fraud allegations required security involvement, federal documentation, and about 4 hours of paperwork. Are you certain about this? Absolutely certain, Victoria replied, shooting a triumphant look at Amara. I've already documented the incident, and I'm requesting immediate removal. Amara finally stood up, her movement slow and deliberate. At 5 feet 6 inches, she wasn't physically imposing, but something about her bearing made everyone in the cabin pay attention. She looked directly at Victoria, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than anger. Ma'am, you are about to make the biggest mistake of your professional life. I am asking you one final time to check your computer system, verify my ticket purchase, and allow this flight to proceed normally. Victoria laughed a harsh sound that echoed off the cabin walls. Threatening me now? That's perfect. Michael, call security immediately. We have a disruptive passenger making threats against crew members. Sarah's live stream hit 5,000 viewers. Comments were flying faster than she could read them. This is insane. Why won't she just check the system? Something is very wrong here. That lady seems way too calm. Plot twist incoming. As Michael Anderson reluctantly reached for his radio to call airport security. None of them realized that they were about to learn exactly why Amara Collins was so calm, so confident, and so utterly unintimidated by their threats. They were about to discover that the quiet woman in seat 2B held more authority over their airline than anyone else in that building. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife when Victoria Hayes made the decision that would end her career. She had been holding Amara's boarding pass for nearly 10 minutes, waving it around like a prop in her performance, but now she wanted to make a statement that would leave no doubt about who was in charge. "You know what happens to fraudulent documents," Victoria announced to the cabin, her voice carrying the theatrical quality of someone who believed she was the hero of this story. "They get destroyed. Evidence eliminated." Before anyone could react, Victoria gripped both sides of the boarding pass and tore it in half with a sharp, violent motion. The ripping sound echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Then, not satisfied with the dramatic effect, she tore it again and again until Amara's ticket was nothing but confetti in her hands. The cabin erupted. "Oh my God, she destroyed her ticket. That's insane. Someone call the police." Sarah's live stream exploded from 5,000 to 15,000 viewers in seconds as she captured the moment. Her voice was breathless with shock. She just ripped up the passenger's ticket. "This is live. People, this is actually happening." Amara stared at the pieces of paper falling from Victoria's hands like snow. For the first time since the confrontation began, her composed facade cracked slightly. Her jaw tightened, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and something dangerous flickered in her eyes. "Did you just destroy federal documentation?" Amara asked, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Victoria smirked, drunk on what she believed was victory. "I destroyed a fake ticket. And now you have no proof of purchase, which means you have no right to be on this aircraft." Jennifer Walsh applauded softly. "Good work, Victoria. That's exactly what we're supposed to do with fraudulent documents." David Thompson shot to his feet. "Are you people insane? You can't just destroy someone's property without verification." "This is completely illegal." "Sir, please sit down," Victoria commanded. "This doesn't concern you." "The hell it doesn't," David snapped. "I'm a corporate attorney, and what I just witnessed was destruction of property, denial of service, and probably half a dozen federal violations." Carlos Rivera emerged fully from the cockpit, his face grave. "Victoria, what have you done? You can't destroy tickets without going through proper channels." Victoria whirled on him. "I followed protocol. When we identify fraudulent documents, we remove them from circulation." "But you didn't verify it was fraudulent," Carlos protested. "You never checked the system." Michael Anderson had pushed his way into the cabin and was staring at the paper scraps on the floor with the expression of a man watching his career dissolve. "Victoria, please tell me you verified that ticket was fake before you destroyed it." Victoria's confidence flickered for just a moment. I know fraud when I see it. The verification was visual." "Visual verification isn't enough for destruction of documents," Michael said, his voice rising. "Do you realize what kind of liability you've just created?" Sarah's phone was shaking as she live-streamed the chaos. Comments were flooding in faster than she could read. "Call the FBI. This is illegal detention. She has rights. Where's the captain? This is going viral." Amara remained seated, but her posture had changed. She was no longer the casual passenger trying to get to her destination. She was a federal investigator who had just watched a civilian destroy federal documentation while denying her civil rights in front of dozens of witnesses and thousands of people watching online. Ma'am Amara said to Victoria, her voice now carrying unmistakable authority, "You have just committed several federal offenses. I strongly suggest you contact your captain immediately." Victoria laughed hysterically. "Federal offenses? You're adorable. The only federal offense here was your attempt to board with fraudulent documents. And now that the evidence is destroyed, you have nothing. I have everything, Amara replied quietly. Something about her tone made the cabin go silent. Even the phone notifications seemed to pause. I have my credit card statement showing the purchase. I have my email confirmation. I have my phone records showing when I made the reservation. I have my federal identification. And now I have a cabin full of witnesses and thousands of people online who watched you destroy valid airline documentation without verification. Victoria's smirk faltered. Federal identification. What are you talking about? Amara reached into her backpack and withdrew a leather wallet. She opened it slowly, deliberately, and held it up so Victoria could see the contents. The gold badge gleamed under the cabin lights, and the words Federal Aviation Administration were clearly visible. Victoria stared at the badge like it was a snake about to strike. "That's fake," she whispered, but her voice had lost all conviction. "Inspector Amara Collins, FAA Safety Division." Amara announced, her voice now carrying the full weight of federal authority. "Badge number 7489. And you, Ms. Hayes, have just interfered with a federal investigation while denying civil rights to a federal officer." The cabin exploded again, but this time it was with cheers, applause, and the sound of Carlos Rivera saying, "Oh shit," loud enough for everyone to hear. Victoria's face went white, then red, then white again. Jennifer Walsh backed away from her like she was radioactive. Michael Anderson looked like he was about to faint. Sarah's live stream hit 50,000 viewers and she was screaming into her phone. "She's a federal agent. The passenger is a federal agent. This flight attendant just attacked a federal agent." But Victoria, in her shock and desperation, made one final catastrophic mistake. "That badge is fake too," she declared, her voice shrill with panic. "People can buy those online. I'm not falling for this scam." And with that denial, with that refusal to acknowledge reality even when it was staring her in the face, Victoria Hayes sealed her fate. Because now she wasn't just a flight attendant who had discriminated against a passenger. She was a civilian who had knowingly interfered with a federal officer in the performance of her duties. And Amara Collins was about to show her exactly what that meant. The moment Amara Collins revealed her federal badge, the entire dynamic of Flight 447 shifted like tectonic plates grinding against each other. But Victoria Hayes, trapped in her own web of assumptions and arrogance, couldn't see the ground crumbling beneath her feet. "That badge doesn't mean anything," Victoria declared, her voice rising to near hysteria. "Anyone can buy a fake federal badge online for $20. I've seen them before." Carlos Rivera stared at Victoria like she had just announced her intention to hijack the plane. "Victoria, stop talking. Right now. Stop talking. Stop." But Victoria was beyond listening to reason. 18 years of unchallenged authority had created a monster of entitlement, and she wasn't about to back down from what she saw as the ultimate challenge to her domain. "Michael," she called to the gate supervisor, "call airport police immediately. This woman is now impersonating a federal agent, which is a felony. She needs to be arrested." Michael Anderson's face had gone completely pale. He knew what federal badges looked like, had seen them dozens of times during security inspections and regulatory visits. The badge in Amara's wallet looked absolutely authentic, and his 20-year career was telling him to run, not walk away from this situation. "Victoria," he said quietly, "maybe we should verify." "There's nothing to verify," Victoria shrieked. "She's a scam artist, a criminal, and I'm not going to let her intimidate anyone else." Sarah Martinez's live stream had exploded to over 100,000 viewers. Comments were flowing like a waterfall. "She's digging her own grave. Someone stop her. This is insane. Flight attendant versus federal agent. She's going to prison." The hashtag Skyline Shame was trending nationally, and news outlets were already picking up the story. But inside the cabin, Victoria was oblivious to the digital wildfire she had ignited. Amara remained seated, but her entire demeanor had transformed. Gone was any pretense of being a casual passenger. She was now Inspector Collins, and her voice carried the unmistakable authority of the federal government. Ms. Hayes. Amara said each word precisely enunciated. I am ordering you to contact Captain Rodriguez immediately. This aircraft is now subject to federal investigation, and all crew members are required to cooperate fully with federal authorities. Victoria laughed, but it was the unhinged laugh of someone who had crossed a line they didn't know existed. You can't order me to do anything. I'm the senior flight attendant on this aircraft. You're just a passenger with a fake badge and a bad attitude. Jennifer Walsh, who had been Victoria's loyal supporter throughout the confrontation, was beginning to realize the magnitude of the disaster unfolding before her. She tugged on Victoria's sleeve. Vicky, maybe we should. Victoria spun on her. Don't you dare back down now, Jenny. This is exactly what they train us for. Passenger tries to scam their way into first class, gets caught, pulls out fake federal ID to intimidate us. Well, I'm not intimidated. David Thompson stood up from his seat in one. His corporate attorney. Instincts in full alarm mode. Ma'am, I'm advising you in my capacity as a lawyer to stop talking immediately. You are creating liability for yourself and this airline that could bankrupt both of you. Victoria whirled on him. And who are you supposed to be? Another fake federal agent? A fake lawyer? Let me guess you're also the Secret Service. David held up his business card. David Thompson, Senior Partner, Hartwell Brooks and Associates. I specialize in corporate liability and federal compliance. And I'm telling you as an attorney that you are currently committing federal crimes that could result in decades in prison. But Victoria was past the point of rational thought. The suggestion that she might be wrong about anything was so incomprehensible to her that she couldn't process it. Instead, she doubled down with the fury of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing. I don't care if you're the Supreme Court, she screamed. This is my aircraft, my cabin, my rules. And rule number 1 is that people like her don't belong in first class. The phrase people like her hit the cabin like a physical blow. Every passenger understood exactly what Victoria meant, and the collective intake of breath was audible. Sarah's live stream chat exploded. Did she just say that openly racist on live TV career over someone called the media? Amara stood up slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Ms. Hayes, you have now made discriminatory statements based on race in violation of federal civil rights laws. You have destroyed federal documentation without authorization. You have interfered with a federal investigation, and you have refused to comply with lawful orders from a federal inspector. Victoria's face was now completely flushed, her hair coming loose from its perfect bun spittle forming at the corners of her mouth. I don't recognize your authority. You're not a real federal agent. People like you don't become federal agents. The second people like you sent another shockwave through the cabin. Several passengers were now standing phones out documenting every word. Carlos Rivera had heard enough. That's it, I'm getting the captain. But before he could move toward the cockpit, Victoria grabbed his arm. Don't you dare abandon me, Carlos. We're crew. We stick together. She's trying to divide us. Carlos looked down at Victoria's hand on his uniform, then back at her face, and saw someone he no longer recognized. Let go of me, Victoria. Right now. I will not let go, Victoria shouted. And I will not let this scammer destroy our careers with her fake badges and her victim act. That's when Michael Anderson made the call that would echo through aviation history. With shaking hands, he pulled out his radio and spoke into it with a voice that cracked with tension. Control. This is Gate B47. I need Airport Police TSA and Federal Security at Gate B47 immediately. We have a... Situation involving a possible federal agent and crew misconduct. Victoria's head snapped toward him. Michael? What are you doing? My job, Michael replied grimly. Something I should have done 20 minutes ago. Within the cabin, Amara pulled out her own phone and dialed a number from memory. When someone answered, she spoke in calm, professional tones that nonetheless carried clearly throughout the first-class cabin. This is Inspector Collins, badge 7489. I need an immediate supervisory response to Hartsfield Airport Gate B47. I have a federal incident involving crew discrimination and interference with an investigation. Yes, sir. Multiple witnesses and live video documentation. Yes, sir. Skyline Airways Flight 447. She hung up and looked directly at Victoria. Federal supervisors are en route. Airport police are en route. TSA is en route. This aircraft is now grounded pending federal investigation. Victoria stared at her, and for the first time since the confrontation began, a flicker of real fear crossed her face. But instead of backing down, she made one final desperate play. Fine, she screamed. If you want to play federal agent, let's see how federal agents handle real security threats. She grabbed the intercom handset, and her voice boomed throughout the entire aircraft, reaching not just the first-class cabin, but all 180 passengers on board. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your senior flight attendant. We have a passenger in first class who is impersonating a federal agent and making threats against crew members. For the safety and security of all passengers, this flight is delayed until law enforcement can remove this individual from the aircraft. The lie was so brazen, so complete, that even Jennifer Walsh gasped in shock. Throughout the cabin, passengers began standing, looking toward first-class phones coming out everywhere. But Victoria wasn't done. She keyed the intercom again. I want everyone to know that Skyline Airways will not be intimidated by scam artists or fake federal agents. We will protect our passengers and our crew from criminals who think they can abuse our hospitality. That's when the cabin erupted into complete chaos. Passengers began shouting, some supporting Victoria, others demanding answers, still others calling for her removal. Sarah's live stream hit 200,000 viewers, with major news networks now picking up the feed. And through it all, Amara Collins stood in the aisle of first class, her federal badge visible in her hand, her face calm, but her eyes promising consequences that Victoria Hayes couldn't even imagine. Because now it wasn't just discrimination. Now it wasn't just interference with a federal officer. Now it was defamation of a federal agent broadcast to an entire aircraft and transmitted live to hundreds of thousands of people online. Victoria Hayes had just committed career suicide on national television, and she still didn't realize it. Sarah Martinez had started the day as a travel blogger with 50,000 followers across her social platforms. She specialized in airline reviews, travel tips, and the occasional story about interesting people she met on flights. She had never expected to become the breaking news source for one of the biggest airline discrimination scandals in modern history. But that's exactly what was happening as her live stream crossed 300,000 viewers and major news outlets began reaching out to license her footage. This is absolutely insane, Sarah whispered into her phone, trying to keep her voice low while still capturing the audio from the front of the cabin. I've never seen anything like this in 15 years of flying. The flight attendant has completely lost her mind. The comments on her stream were moving so fast they were impossible to read, but the overall sentiment was clear. Fire her now, sue the airline. This is criminal respect, the badge justice for the inspector. But Sarah's live stream was just one piece of a digital explosion that was reshaping the story in real time. Throughout the aircraft, passengers were posting to TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Videos were being shared, retweeted, and reposted faster than anyone could track. The hashtag Skyline Shame had evolved into multiple trending topics. Hashtag FA, A Inspector was approaching 500,000 mentions. Hashtag Victoria. Hayes was trending with overwhelmingly negative sentiment. Hashtag discrimination. In the skies was being picked up by civil rights organizations. Hashtag fake ticket was being used ironically to mock Victoria's claims. In Seat 3C, Marcus Williams, a software engineer, had been quietly live-tweeting the entire incident to his 15,000 followers. His thread had been retweeted over 50,000 times. Thread: I'm on Flight 447 and watching a flight attendant destroy her career in real time. She accused a black woman of having a fake first-class ticket, then tore it up without checking the system. Plot twist: the woman is an FAA inspector. This is insane. Update: flight attendant is now claiming the federal badge is fake. Multiple passengers trying to tell her to stop. She's not listening. This is going to end so badly for her. Update 2. She just announced to the entire plane that the inspector is impersonating a federal agent on a live stream with 300,000 viewers. I cannot believe what I'm watching. The viral explosion was creating a feedback loop. As more people shared the story, more viewers joined Sarah's live stream, which created more social media content, which brought even more attention. Traditional media outlets were scrambling to keep up with a story that was evolving by the minute. CNN had picked up the story with the breaking news banner, "Flight Attendant versus FAA Inspector Discrimination Caught on Live Video." Fox News was running "Airline Employee Destroys Passenger Ticket." Claims federal badge is fake. MSNBC led with viral video shows alleged racial profiling on commercial flight. But the most damaging coverage was coming from aviation industry publications. These were the outlets read by airline executives, FAA officials, and aviation professionals. And they were not treating this as entertainment. Aviation Week's breaking news alert: FAA inspector allegedly discriminated against during undercover investigation. Flight: Global's headline: Skyline Airways crew under federal investigation after viral incident. The story was also crossing international boundaries. The BBC, Reuters, and other global outlets were picking up the American story because it perfectly encapsulated ongoing conversations about racism, authority, and accountability in the social media age. Inside the aircraft, Victoria Hayes remained oblivious to the digital wildfire consuming her reputation. She was focused entirely on what she saw as a battle for control of her aircraft, a battle she was convinced she was winning. "Jennifer, call the head office," Victoria commanded. "Tell them we have a situation under control, but we need backup for the federal investigation that's coming." Jennifer Walsh stared at her in disbelief. "Victoria, there is no federal investigation coming. There's a federal investigation happening. Right here, right now. She is the investigation." But Victoria waved her off dismissively. "Don't let her intimidate you, too. The badge is fake. The authority is fake. Everything is fake, except the discrimination lawsuit she's planning to file." Well, she picked the wrong flight attendant to mess with. Carlos Rivera had retrieved Captain Luis Rodriguez from the cockpit, and now both pilots stood at the entrance to first class, taking in the scene with the wide-eyed expression of professionals watching a colleague commit career suicide. Captain Rodriguez, a 22-year veteran of commercial aviation, had seen federal inspectors before. He knew what their badges looked like, how they carried themselves, and most importantly, he knew they didn't play games. The woman in 2B had every marking of legitimate federal authority, and his crew was treating her like a criminal. "Victoria," Captain Rodriguez said quietly, "I need to speak with you privately." Victoria spun around, her hair now completely disheveled, her uniform wrinkled from the physical confrontation. "Captain, perfect timing. This passenger is trying to scam her way into first class, and now she's impersonating a federal agent to avoid the consequences." Captain Rodriguez looked at Amara, who nodded and held up her credentials. He examined them closely, noting the official hologram, the federal seal, the perfectly matched identification numbers. His face went pale. "Victoria," he said slowly, "this badge is real." Victoria laughed hysterically. Of course she says it's real. They all say their fake badges are real. That's the point of the scam. I'm telling you as your captain that this is a legitimate federal inspector. Victoria's laughter died abruptly. She stared at Captain Rodriguez as if he had betrayed her personally. You're falling for it too. After 22 years, you're falling for a $20 fake badge. Victoria, you need to apologize immediately and comply with Inspector Collins's requests. But Victoria was too deep in her delusion to find her way out. I will not apologize to a criminal. I will not comply with fake authority, and I will not let this airline be scammed by someone who thinks she can wave a plastic badge and get whatever she wants. That's when the first airport police officers appeared at the aircraft door. Officer James Patterson, a 15-year veteran of airport security, entered the cabin with his partner, Officer Maria Santos. They had responded to a call about a possible federal incident, which automatically elevated the priority to the highest level. Who requested police assistance? Officer Patterson called out. Victoria immediately rushed toward them. Officers, thank God you're here. We have a woman impersonating a federal agent and making threats against crew members. Officer Patterson looked past Victoria to where Amara stood calmly holding her credentials. He had seen enough federal badges in his career to recognize authenticity, and everything about Inspector Collins screamed legitimate authority. Ma'am, may I see your identification? Amara handed over her badge wallet. Officer Patterson examined it carefully, noting the weight of the badge, the quality of the materials, the holographic security features that were impossible to fake. He looked up at his partner and nodded slightly. Inspector Collins. What's the situation here? Victoria's mouth fell open. You're falling for it too. She's a scammer, a criminal officer. Santos turned to Victoria with the expression of someone who had seen too many people make too many bad decisions. Ma'am, you're accusing a federal inspector of impersonating a federal agent. Yes, exactly. She's fake. Are you absolutely certain about that accusation? Completely certain. Officer Santos looked at her partner, then back at Victoria. Ma'am, false accusation of a federal officer is a serious crime. Are you sure you want to maintain this position? Victoria's confidence flickered for just a moment, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. I'm maintaining it because it's true. That badge is fake. Her authority is fake, and she's trying to intimidate everyone. Meanwhile, Sarah's live stream had reached 500,000 viewers, and the real-time commentary was brutal. She's doubling down. Even the cops know the badge is real. Someone stop her. This is painful to watch. She's destroying her life. The situation had attracted attention throughout the terminal. Passengers waiting at nearby gates were pressing against the windows trying to see what was happening. Gate agents were gathering in clusters whispering about the drama at B47. But the most significant attention was coming from the Skyline Airways corporate offices. In a crisis management room 40 miles away, executives were watching the live stream with mounting horror as their brand was destroyed in real time by an employee who had gone completely rogue. Get me the CEO, someone shouted. Get me the legal team. Get me everyone. Our stock is going to crater when the markets open tomorrow. Back on the aircraft, Amara Collins finally decided that she had collected enough evidence. She had remained professional throughout Victoria's meltdown. But now it was time to exercise her federal authority. Officer Patterson, she said formally, I am placing this aircraft under federal investigation for civil rights violations. I need all crew members detained for questioning, and I need this entire incident documented for federal prosecution. Victoria's face went white. Federal prosecution. You have interfered with a federal investigation, discriminated against passengers based on race-destroyed federal documentation, and made false statements to law enforcement officers. Yes, Ms. Hayes. Federal prosecution. And that's when Victoria Hayes finally realized that her 18-year career was over. Her reputation was destroyed, and her freedom was now at risk. But by then, it was far too late to take back any of the words that had already cost her everything. Captain Luis Rodriguez had been flying commercial aircraft for 22 years, and in that time he had seen every kind of crisis imaginable. Mechanical failures, medical emergencies, unruly passengers, weather disasters, and even security threats. But he had never seen anything quite like what was unfolding in the first-class cabin of his Boeing 737-800. As he approached the scene, Rodriguez could feel the tension radiating from the confrontation like heat from an engine fire. Victoria Hayes, his senior flight attendant, was standing in the aisle gesticulating wildly at a young black woman who sat with the calm composure of someone completely in control of the situation. Police officers flanked both sides. Passengers were filming everything, and the atmosphere was charged with the kind of electricity that preceded catastrophic storms. "What exactly is happening here?" Captain Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying the authority that came with being the final decision-maker on any aircraft. Victoria immediately rushed toward him, her uniform disheveled, her carefully constructed professional appearance crumbling under stress. "Captain, finally, this passenger has been trying to scam her way into first class with a fake ticket. When I caught her, she pulled out a fake federal badge and started making threats against the crew." Rodriguez looked past Victoria to the woman in seat 2B. There was something about her bearing her stillness in the middle of chaos that suggested someone comfortable with authority rather than intimidated by it. "Ma'am, may I see your credentials?" Amara Collins stood and handed over her badge wallet without a word. Rodriguez examined it with the careful attention of someone whose career depended on recognizing authentic documentation. He had seen federal badges during safety inspections, regulatory reviews, and incident investigations. The badge in his hands had the weight, the materials, and the security features that marked it as genuine federal property. Inspector Collins Rodriguez said formally, "I apologize for this situation. What can I do to assist your investigation?" Victoria stared at her captain as if he had just announced his intention to crash the plane. "You can't be serious. You're falling for her scam, too." Rodriguez turned to Victoria with the expression of a man watching his employee destroy not just her own career, but potentially his as well. "Victoria, this is a legitimate federal inspector. What you've described as a scam is actually a federal investigation." No. Victoria's voice rose to near hysteria. "Captain, I've been doing this for 18 years. I know when someone doesn't belong in first class. I know when someone is trying to pull a fast one on us." Officer Patterson stepped forward. "Captain, we've verified Inspector Collins's credentials. They're authentic. What we have here is a crew member who has allegedly discriminated against a federal officer and then refused to acknowledge federal authority." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Rodriguez felt his stomach drop as he realized the magnitude of the situation. This wasn't just a customer service issue that could be resolved with apologies and vouchers. This was a federal incident that would involve investigations, lawsuits, and potentially criminal charges. Victoria Rodriguez said quietly, "I need you to apologize to Inspector Collins immediately and comply with whatever she requests." But Victoria was beyond rational thought. 18 years of unchallenged authority had created a monster that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't admit fault, couldn't see reality, even when it was staring her in the face. "I will not apologize to a criminal," Victoria screamed. "I will not bow down to someone with a fake badge, and I will not let this airline be intimidated by race-baiting scam artists." The phrase race-baiting scam artists hit the cabin like a physical blow. Even the passengers who had been trying to stay out of the confrontation gasped at the naked racism of the statement. Sarah's live stream exploded with comments. "She just said race-baiting openly. Racist on camera fire. Her now prosecute her. This is insane. Captain Rodriguez stared at Victoria as if seeing her for the first time. Victoria, you're relieved of duty immediately. Report to the crew quarters and remain there until further notice. You can't relieve me. I'm protecting this aircraft. You're destroying this aircraft, Rodriguez replied grimly. And you're destroying this airline. He turned to Amara with the professional respect due to a federal inspector. Inspector Collins, I place myself and this crew at your disposal. How do you want to proceed? Amara had been documenting every word of the confrontation, taking notes on her phone, observing the reactions of crew members and passengers. Now she was ready to exercise her full federal authority. Captain Rodriguez, this aircraft is now under federal investigation for civil rights violations. I need to interview all crew members, examine passenger manifests, and review your training protocols regarding passenger discrimination. Understood. Whatever you need. Victoria was still standing in the aisle, her face red with rage and humiliation. This is mutiny. You're all being fooled by an elaborate scam. Jennifer Walsh, who had been Victoria's loyal supporter throughout the confrontation, finally stepped away from her colleague. Victoria, please stop. You're making everything worse. Victoria spun on Jennifer with venom. Et tu, Jenny. You're abandoning me too. I'm not abandoning you, Jennifer said quietly. I'm trying to save what's left of your career. But it was far too late for that. Victoria's career had ended the moment she tore up a federal inspector's boarding pass on camera in front of hundreds of thousands of witnesses. Everything that happened now was just documentation for the inevitable prosecution. Captain Rodriguez pulled out his phone and dialed the emergency number for Skyline Airways corporate headquarters. This is Captain Rodriguez, Flight 447. I have a federal incident involving crew misconduct. I need immediate legal and management response. The voice on the other end was tense. Rodriguez, we're watching the live stream. The CEO is en route. Legal is en route. PR is having a meltdown. How bad is it? Rodriguez looked around the cabin at the filming passengers, the federal inspector, the police officers, and his disgraced flight attendant. It's career-ending bad. For multiple people. Meanwhile, Amara was conducting what amounted to a real-time federal investigation. She interviewed David Thompson, who provided detailed testimony about Victoria's discriminatory behavior. She spoke with other passengers who corroborated the pattern of bias. She documented the torn boarding pass, the false statements, and the interference with federal authority. Captain Rodriguez Amara said formally, based on my investigation, I'm recommending immediate termination for Ms. Hayes and formal review for any supervisory personnel who enabled this behavior. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Inspector, you have my full cooperation. Victoria's actions do not represent this airline or this crew. But Victoria wasn't finished. Even facing federal charges, even watching her career disintegrate, even seeing her captain and colleagues abandon her, she couldn't let go of her delusion. Fine, she screamed at Amara. You want to play federal agent? Let's see how tough you are when this video gets edited to show the truth. Let's see how your fake badge holds up under real scrutiny. Let's see what happens when people find out you're just another race-baiting troublemaker trying to get a payday. The cabin fell silent. Even Victoria's most ardent supporters were now staring at her with horror and disgust. Amara Collins looked at Victoria Hayes with something that might have been pity if it weren't mixed with professional determination. Ms. Hayes, Amara said quietly, you have just threatened a federal officer with retaliation. That's a separate felony charge. Officer Patterson, I want that statement documented. Officer Patterson was already writing. Yes, ma'am. Captain Rodriguez closed his eyes and tried to calculate how much this single incident was going to cost Skyline Airways in legal fees, settlements, lost business, and reputation damage. The number was going to be astronomical. But Victoria Hayes was beyond caring about costs or consequences or careers or futures. She was trapped in a fantasy where she was the hero, where her badge of seniority meant more than federal authority, where being right mattered more than being smart. And in that fantasy, she was about to learn the difference between imagined power and real power, between airline authority and federal authority, between what she thought she deserved and what she was actually going to get. The moment had arrived when Amara Collins would transform from victim to authority, when the quiet woman in casual clothes would reveal the full weight of federal power that Victoria Hayes had been attacking without realizing it. Captain Rodriguez took the intercom handset, his voice heavy with the knowledge that he was about to announce one of the most significant incidents in Skyline Airways history. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. I need to inform you that we have a federal aviation inspector on board conducting an official investigation. All passengers, please remain seated while we resolve this matter. The announcement sent ripples of excitement through the cabin. Passengers who had been watching the drama unfold suddenly understood they were witnessing something historic. Phones came out throughout the aircraft as people realized they had front-row seats to a federal investigation. But Victoria Hayes, standing in the aisle with her uniform wrinkled and her authority evaporating, still couldn't grasp the reality of her situation. "Captain, you're being manipulated," she cried out. "This is exactly what these scammers do. They get one person to believe them, then use that to convince everyone else." Amara Collins stood up and addressed the cabin with the voice of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "My name is Inspector Amara Collins, badge number 7489, Federal Aviation Administration Safety Division. For the past 6 months, the FAA has been investigating complaints of passenger discrimination on Skyline Airways flights. Today's incident represents a textbook example of the behavior we've been investigating." Her voice carried clearly through the cabin, calm and professional, but with unmistakable authority. Several passengers began applauding, but Amara raised her hand for silence. "I boarded this flight using my personal credit card and identification to conduct an undercover investigation. Ms. Hayes discriminated against me based on my appearance, destroyed valid airline documentation without verification, and interfered with a federal investigation." Sarah's live stream had reached 750,000 viewers, with major news networks now carrying the feed live. The comments were a mix of outrage and vindication. Justice. She got what she deserved. Federal badge beats airline badge. This is why we need oversight accountability in real time. Victoria stared at Amara as if seeing her for the first time. The casual clothes, the worn backpack, the youth that Victoria had interpreted as inexperience, suddenly made sense in a completely different context. This wasn't a college student trying to scam an upgrade. This was a federal investigator doing her job. "That's impossible," Victoria whispered, but her voice had lost all conviction. "People like you don't become federal inspectors." Amara's expression hardened. "People like me. What exactly do you mean by that? Ms. Hayes?" Victoria's face flushed as she realized she was being recorded, that her words were being broadcast live to hundreds of thousands of people, that every discriminatory statement was becoming evidence in a federal case. I meant young people. People who dress casually." "No," Amara replied firmly. "You meant black people. You've made that clear throughout this incident. You believe that black people don't belong in first class, don't become federal inspectors, don't deserve the same respect as other passengers." The accusation hung in the air like an indictment because everyone in that cabin had heard Victoria's comments, had seen her assumptions, had watched her discriminate based on nothing more than Amara's appearance. Officer Patterson stepped forward. "Inspector Collins, do you want to file formal charges?" Amara looked at Victoria, who was now trembling with the realization of what she had done. For a moment, something like compassion flickered across Amara's face. Then she remembered every complaint she had read, every passenger who had been humiliated, every person who had been made to feel less than human by employees like Victoria Hayes. Yes, Officer Patterson, I want charges filed for interference with a federal officer, civil rights violations, destruction of federal documentation, and making false statements to law enforcement. Victoria's knees buckled slightly. Federal charges. You attacked a federal inspector, Ms. Hayes. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? Jennifer Walsh, who had been standing silently in the background, finally found her voice. Victoria, I tried to warn you. I tried to tell you to stop. Victoria turned on her former ally with desperate fury. You said the badge looked fake. You supported everything I did. I said, maybe we should verify it. Jennifer protested. I never said to destroy her ticket. Captain Rodriguez was reviewing the incident in his mind, calculating the damage to his airline, his crew, his own career. Inspector Collins. What happens now? Amara pulled out her phone and began making calls with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. This is Inspector Collins. I need a full incident response team at Hartsfield Airport, Gate B47. Federal discrimination case with criminal charges. Yes, sir. It's the Skyline Airways investigation. The pattern is confirmed. She hung up and looked at Captain Rodriguez. FAA investigators are en route. Your aircraft is grounded until we complete our review. All crew members will be interviewed, training records, examined, complaint files reviewed. Victoria was still standing in the aisle, but she was no longer the commanding presence who had started this confrontation. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, as if the revelation of Amara's true identity had physically shrunk her. This isn't fair, Victoria whispered. I was just doing my job, protecting the airline from fraud. Amara's response was quiet but devastating. Your job was to serve passengers equally regardless of their race. Instead, you chose to discriminate, humiliate, and ultimately assault a federal officer. Those were your choices, Ms. Hayes. Now you get to live with the consequences. David Thompson, who had been documenting the entire incident from his seat in 1A, stood up and addressed Amara directly. Inspector, I want to testify about what I witnessed. That woman made assumptions based purely on race, and she persisted even when multiple people told her she was wrong. Other passengers began volunteering as witnesses. I saw everything. She was completely out of line. The inspector handled it perfectly. That flight attendant was racist from the beginning. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from Carlos Rivera, the co-pilot who had worked with Victoria for 3 years. Inspector Collins. Carlos said quietly, This isn't the first time. Victoria has done this before. Different passengers, same pattern. We all knew about it, but nobody ever reported it because she was senior crew. Victoria's face went white. Carlos, you're lying. You never said anything, because I was a coward, Carlos replied. I should have reported you years ago. Maybe if I had, none of this would have happened. The confession sent another shockwave through the cabin. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern of behavior that had been enabled by a culture of silence and complicity. Amara made another note on her phone. Carlos, I'll need a formal statement about previous incidents. Any other crew members who want to cooperate with the investigation should identify themselves now. 2 more flight attendants from coach class raised their hands, both looking terrified but determined to tell the truth. Meanwhile, Sarah's live stream had become the center of a global conversation about racism, authority, and accountability. Major news outlets were cutting into regular programming to cover the story. Aviation industry publications were analyzing the implications for airline training and oversight. Civil rights organizations were calling for comprehensive investigations of airline discrimination. But inside the cabin of Flight 447, The focus was on one woman who had made a series of catastrophic decisions that would define the rest of her life. Victoria Hayes looked around at her colleagues, abandoning her at the passengers, condemning her at the federal inspector who had just destroyed her career. And finally, perhaps for the first time in 18 years, she began to understand the real cost of her prejudice. "I never meant for this to happen," she whispered. Amara looked at her with something that might have been pity. "Ms. Hayes, you discriminated against passengers for years. You destroyed federal documentation on camera. You interfered with a federal investigation in front of hundreds of thousands of witnesses. The only thing you didn't mean was to get caught." And with those words, the transformation was complete. Victoria Hayes was no longer a flight attendant with authority over passengers. She was a defendant in a federal case with her life in ruins and her freedom at risk. The woman she had tried to humiliate and remove was now the federal inspector who would determine her fate. And the quiet passenger in seat 2B had just shown the world that real authority doesn't come from a uniform or a position. It comes from integrity, professionalism, and the power of the federal government behind you. The arrival of federal investigators at Gate B47 transformed the situation from a viral incident into an official government operation. Within 30 minutes of Amara's phone call, 3 black SUVs had pulled up to the aircraft, and a team of federal agents, FAA investigators, and Department of Justice attorneys had boarded the plane. Leading the team was Supervisory Inspector Patricia Williams, a 20-year veteran of the FAA who had seen every kind of airline misconduct imaginable. But as she reviewed the live stream footage and witness statements, even she was shocked by the brazenness of Victoria's behavior. Inspector Collins Williams said formally, "Please brief me on the incident." Amara provided a concise professional summary of the events from her initial boarding to Victoria's final threats of retaliation. Throughout her report, Victoria stood in the crew quarters area under the watchful eye of airport police, her face a mask of disbelief and growing terror. The subject destroyed federal documentation without verification, made discriminatory statements based on race, interfered with a federal investigation, and threatened retaliation against a federal officer, Amara concluded, all in front of multiple witnesses and live video documentation. Williams reviewed her notes, and this was part of our ongoing discrimination investigation. "Yes, ma'am. The undercover operation was designed to document the behavior described in passenger complaints. The subject's actions exceeded our worst-case scenarios." Williams looked at Victoria with the expression of a federal prosecutor sizing up a defendant. "Ms. Hayes, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Victoria's mouth fell open. "You're reading me my rights. You're under federal arrest for interfering with a federal officer, civil rights violations, and destruction of federal property." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. Federal arrest, federal charges, federal prosecution. The 18-year career she had built was not just over. It was becoming evidence in a criminal case. "This can't be happening," Victoria whispered. "I was protecting the airline." "You were discriminating against passengers," Williams replied curtly. "And now you're going to face the consequences." As federal agents led Victoria off the aircraft in handcuffs, passengers throughout the cabin began applauding. Sarah's live stream captured the moment, and her comment section exploded with reactions. "Justice served handcuffs for discrimination. Federal government doesn't play." She got exactly what she deserved. Accountability in action, but the consequences extended far beyond Victoria Hayes. Captain Rodriguez found himself facing a career-threatening investigation into his oversight of discriminatory crew members. Jennifer Walsh was suspended pending review of her role in supporting Victoria's behavior. Michael Anderson, the gate supervisor, faced discipline for failing to properly handle the initial complaint. The live stream had now reached over 1 million viewers, making it one of the most watched real-time justice events in social media history. News outlets around the world were covering the story with headlines that would define Victoria's legacy. Flight attendant arrested after discriminating against FAA inspector. Viral video shows federal agent handcuffed airline employee. Undercover investigation exposes airline discrimination. But perhaps the most significant immediate consequence was the corporate response from Skyline Airways. CEO Franklin Webb had arrived at the airport within 2 hours of the incident, along with a full crisis management team, legal counsel, and public relations specialists. Webb boarded the aircraft and immediately approached Amara with the demeanor of a man trying to save his company from complete destruction. Inspector Collins: I'm Franklin Webb, CEO of Skyline Airways. I want to personally apologize for Ms. Hayes' behavior and assure you that it does not represent our company values. Amara looked at him with the skeptical expression of a federal investigator who had seen too many executives claim ignorance of problems that had been festering for years. Mr. Webb, our investigation shows that Ms. Hayes had 47 complaints against her over 5 years. Your company took no meaningful disciplinary action. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern of behavior that your airline enabled. Webb's face went pale. He had hoped this was a single rogue employee situation that could be handled with an apology and a termination. Learning that it was part of a documented pattern meant federal sanctions, massive lawsuits, and potentially criminal liability for the company itself. Inspector, we want to cooperate fully with your investigation. Whatever changes you recommend, we'll implement immediately. Amara handed him a thick folder. These are the preliminary findings from our 6-month investigation. Your airline has failed to provide equal service to minority passengers, failed to properly train employees on civil rights law, and failed to investigate discrimination complaints. This incident was entirely predictable based on your company's practices. Webb opened the folder and began reading, his expression growing more horrified with each page. The documentation was comprehensive, damning, and indisputable. Skyline Airways wasn't just facing the consequences of one employee's bad behavior, they were facing federal action for institutional discrimination. What do you need from us? Webb asked quietly. Complete cooperation with federal investigators, immediate implementation of comprehensive anti-discrimination training, independent oversight of complaint processes, and a commitment to changing the culture that created employees like Victoria Hayes. Webb nodded grimly. You have my word. Meanwhile, the passenger response was overwhelmingly supportive of Amara's actions. David Thompson approached her as federal investigators continued their work. Inspector Collins, I want to thank you for handling this situation with such professionalism. As someone who flies frequently, I'm grateful that there are people like you ensuring equal treatment for all passengers. Other passengers echoed his sentiments. You made us all feel safer. Thank you for standing up to discrimination. Your composure was incredible. Justice was served today. Sarah Martinez, whose live stream had documented the entire incident, approached Amara with a request. Inspector, would you be willing to make a brief statement to my viewers? They've been incredibly supportive throughout this whole situation. Amara considered for a moment, then nodded. I'd be happy to address the concerns that people have raised. Sarah turned her phone camera toward Amara, and over 1 million viewers watched as the federal inspector who had just changed airline history spoke directly to the public. Today's incident demonstrates why federal oversight of civil rights in aviation is so important. No passenger should ever be discriminated against based on their appearance or their race. The FAA takes these violations seriously, and we will continue to investigate and prosecute discrimination wherever we find it. The statement was brief, professional, and powerful. Within hours, it would be viewed millions of times across multiple platforms, becoming a defining moment in the ongoing conversation about equality and justice in America. But for Amara Collins, the work was far from over. Victoria Hayes was just one flight attendant on one airline. The federal investigation would continue, more companies would be examined, and more changes would be implemented. Because sometimes it takes just one person standing up to discrimination to change an entire industry. And sometimes that person happens to carry a federal badge. The federal investigation into Skyline Airways expanded rapidly beyond the single incident on Flight 447. Within 48 hours of Victoria Hayes' arrest, the Department of Transportation had launched a comprehensive review of the airline's practices, policies, and training procedures. What they discovered was a web of discrimination that extended far beyond one rogue flight attendant. Inspector Amara Collins found herself at the center of the largest airline civil rights investigation in a decade. Working out of a command center established at the Hartsfield Airport Federal Building, she coordinated with a team of investigators, attorneys, and civil rights specialists to examine 5 years of complaint data training records and employee communications. The evidence was overwhelming. Victoria Hayes had indeed received 47 discrimination complaints over her career, but she wasn't alone. The investigation revealed that Skyline Airways had received over 300 complaints alleging racial discrimination in the past 2 years alone. The complaints followed a clear pattern: passengers of color being questioned about their ticket validity, being moved from premium seats without justification, and being treated with suspicion and hostility by crew members. More damaging still were the internal communications discovered during the investigation. Email chains between supervisors showed a culture where discrimination complaints were routinely dismissed or buried. Training materials contained subtle but clear guidance on identifying problem passengers that correlated strongly with racial profiling. Performance evaluations rewarded employees for maintaining cabin standards without defining what those standards actually meant. The most shocking discovery came from recorded crew communications. Federal investigators obtained hundreds of hours of flight crew conversations, both in flight and during layovers, that revealed widespread discriminatory attitudes among Skyline Airways employees. In one recording, Victoria Hayes could be heard telling another flight attendant, "First class is for people who look like they belong there. When someone doesn't fit the profile, you have to ask questions." Another recording captured a conversation between Victoria and Jennifer Walsh about a previous incident. "The black lady in 2B thought she could intimidate me with threats about lawsuits. I told her good luck proving anything. These people always claim discrimination when they get caught trying to scam upgrades." As these recordings became public through court filings, the scope of the problem at Skyline Airways became undeniable. This wasn't isolated bias. It was institutionalized discrimination that had been allowed to flourish for years. The federal investigation team interviewed over 200 former and current Skyline Airways passengers who reported discriminatory treatment. The stories were remarkably consistent. Marcus Johnson, a software executive, described being questioned about his first-class ticket on 3 separate flights, despite being a platinum-level frequent flyer. Dr. Angela Washington, a physician, reported being asked to move to coach for weight and balance reasons that were never explained to white passengers in similar seats. Professor David Mitchell, who had been flying to academic conferences for 20 years, detailed being searched extensively by security after flight attendants reported suspicious behavior that consisted of reading academic journals and taking notes. Each story individually might have been dismissed as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. Together, they painted a picture of deliberate, persistent discrimination that had been enabled by corporate indifference. The investigation also revealed the financial cost of this discrimination. Skyline Airways had quietly settled dozens of discrimination lawsuits over the past 5 years, paying out over $12 million in confidential agreements that included non-disclosure clauses. The airline had essentially been buying silence while allowing discriminatory practices to continue. Media coverage of the expanding investigation was relentless. Major news outlets assigned dedicated reporters to cover every development. Cable news programs featured nightly discussions about airline discrimination, federal oversight, and corporate accountability. The hashtag Skyline shame evolved into a broader conversation about discrimination in travel, with passengers sharing stories from multiple airlines, hotels, and transportation companies. The viral nature of the original incident had created a platform for hundreds of people to share their own experiences with travel-related discrimination. Civil rights organizations seized on the moment to push for broader reforms. The NAACP announced a formal boycott of Skyline Airways until comprehensive changes were implemented. Other organizations called for congressional hearings on discrimination in the airline industry. The stock market response was swift and brutal. Skyline Airways stock dropped 35% in the first week after the incident, wiping out over $2 billion in shareholder value. Credit rating agencies placed the company on negative watch, citing potential legal liabilities and reputation damage. But perhaps the most significant development came when former Skyline Airways employees began coming forward with inside information about the company's practices. James Rodriguez, a former gate supervisor, revealed that employees received informal training on identifying passengers who might be trouble. The training, never documented in official materials, included guidance on watching for passengers whose appearance didn't match their seat class. Maria Santos, a former customer service manager, produced emails showing that discrimination complaints were often resolved by offering minor compensation, while explicitly avoiding any admission of wrongdoing. Thomas Anderson, a former crew scheduler, testified that certain flight attendants, including Victoria Hayes, specifically requested routes with lower percentages of minority passengers. The testimony painted a picture of deliberate discrimination that went far beyond individual bias. Skyline Airways had created systems and processes that enabled and encouraged discriminatory treatment of passengers. As the investigation expanded, other airlines began proactively reviewing their own practices. Delta, United, American, and Southwest all announced enhanced training programs and strengthened complaint procedures, hoping to avoid similar federal scrutiny. The Federal Aviation Administration announced that it would be conducting surprise inspections of airline training programs with particular focus on civil rights compliance. The Department of Transportation indicated that it was considering new regulations requiring airlines to report discrimination complaint data publicly. Meanwhile, Victoria Hayes remained in federal custody, her bail set at $500,000 due to the serious nature of the charges against her. Her attorneys had initially tried to argue that she was simply following company policy, but as the investigation revealed the extent of discriminatory practices at Skyline Airways, that defense became increasingly untenable. Jennifer Walsh, who had supported Victoria during the incident, chose to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for leniency. Her testimony provided crucial insight into the culture aboard Skyline Airways flights and the informal training that encouraged discriminatory behavior. Captain Luis Rodriguez, despite his proper handling of the immediate situation, faced disciplinary action for failing to report previous incidents involving Victoria Hayes. His testimony revealed that multiple pilots had witnessed discriminatory behavior, but had chosen not to report it due to concerns about crew unity and potential retaliation. The investigation also examined the role of Michael Anderson and other gate supervisors who had failed to properly handle discrimination complaints. Internal documents showed that supervisors were actually discouraged from escalating complaints that might result in negative publicity for the airline. As evidence mounted, it became clear that the incident on Flight 447 was not an aberration, but rather the inevitable result of a corporate culture that prioritized profits over passenger rights, crew loyalty over legal compliance, and image management over meaningful change. The federal government's response was comprehensive and unprecedented. Criminal charges were filed against multiple employees. Civil rights lawsuits sought hundreds of millions in damages. Regulatory sanctions threatened the airline's operating certificates. But beyond the legal consequences, the investigation had created something more powerful, a public reckoning with discrimination in travel that would force changes throughout the industry. The quiet woman in seat 2B had not just exposed one bigoted flight attendant. She had uncovered an entire system of discrimination that had been hiding in plain sight for years. And now, thanks to her courage and professionalism, that system was being dismantled piece by piece, ensuring that future passengers would never have to endure what she had experienced on Flight 447. 6 weeks after Victoria Hayes was led off Flight 447 in handcuffs, she sat in a federal courtroom facing the consequences of her 18 years of discrimination. The case had attracted national attention with overflow crowds and media coverage that turned the proceedings into a referendum on accountability and justice in America. Judge Sandra Martinez, a federal district judge with 25 years of experience, had seen many cases of civil rights violations. But the evidence presented in United States versus Victoria Hayes was remarkable for its clarity and comprehensiveness. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, no doubt about what had happened or why. Mrs. Hayes, Judge Martinez said from the bench, "You have been found guilty on all counts. Interference with a federal officer, civil rights violations under Title VI, destruction of federal property, and making false statements to federal agents. These are serious crimes that strike at the foundation of equal treatment under law." Victoria, now wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, looked nothing like the imperious flight attendant who had terrorized passengers for nearly 2 decades. Her blonde hair hung limply around her face. Her skin was pale from weeks in federal detention, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone whose entire worldview had collapsed. "Your Honor," Victoria's attorney began, "my client was simply following what she believed to be company policy. She was trained to watch for suspicious passengers, and she applied that training in what she thought was a legitimate security situation." Judge Martinez reviewed the thick file in front of her, which contained not only the evidence from Flight 447, but testimonies from dozens of passengers who had been discriminated against by Victoria over the years. "Counselor, the evidence shows that your client engaged in a pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning multiple years. This was not a case of misunderstanding policy. This was deliberate, persistent civil rights violations." The judge turned her attention to Victoria directly. "Ms. Hayes, do you have anything to say before I impose sentence?" Victoria stood slowly, her legs shaking. For the first time since her arrest, she seemed to grasp the magnitude of what she had done and the lives she had affected. "Your Honor, I never thought of myself as racist. I thought I was doing my job protecting the airline from fraud. But watching the video of that day, hearing the testimonies of passengers I've served, I realized that my actions came from prejudice, not professionalism." Her voice broke slightly. "I destroyed that inspector's ticket because I couldn't believe someone who looked like her belonged in first class. That belief was wrong. It was cruel, and it caused pain to hundreds of people over the years. I accept responsibility for my actions." Judge Martinez nodded gravely. "Ms. Hayes, your recognition of wrongdoing is noted. However, the severity of your crimes and their impact on civil rights requires substantial punishment." She consulted her notes before continuing. "You are hereby sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. During your supervised release, you are prohibited from working in any customer service capacity. You will also pay restitution to Inspector Collins and perform 500 hours of community service with civil rights organizations." The sentence sent ripples through the courtroom. Victoria's family members wept quietly in the gallery while civil rights advocates nodded with satisfaction. The message was clear: discrimination would be punished swiftly and severely. But Victoria's case was only the beginning of the federal accountability process. Jennifer Walsh, who had pled guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for cooperation, received 6 months in federal prison and 2 years of supervised release. Her testimony had been crucial in establishing the pattern of discrimination at Skyline Airways. Michael Anderson, the gate supervisor who had failed to properly investigate discrimination complaints, was sentenced to probation and community service. His career in aviation was effectively over. The corporate consequences were even more severe. Skyline Airways faced the largest civil rights settlement in aviation history, $150 million to be distributed among passengers who had experienced discrimination. The airline was also required to operate under federal oversight for 5 years, with all training programs, hiring practices, and customer service policies subject to government approval. CEO Franklin Webb, who had tried to distance himself from the discrimination scandal, was forced to resign when internal documents revealed he had been briefed on complaint patterns multiple times but had taken no meaningful action. His successor announced a complete overhaul of company culture and practices. The Department of Transportation imposed additional sanctions. Skyline Airways lost several lucrative routes, faced increased inspection requirements, and was forced to pay millions in regulatory fines. The company's operating margins were decimated, forcing layoffs and route cancellations that affected thousands of employees. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the industry-wide impact of the investigation. The Federal Aviation Administration announced new regulations requiring all airlines to report discrimination complaint data quarterly and to undergo annual civil rights audits. Congress held hearings on discrimination in aviation, with Inspector Amara Collins serving as the lead witness. Her testimony was broadcast nationally and became a defining moment in the ongoing conversation about civil rights in America. The incident on Flight 447 was not isolated, Collins told the Congressional Committee. It was the predictable result of an industry that has prioritized profits over passenger rights, that has allowed discrimination to flourish through willful blindness and cultural indifference. She continued, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority and personal experience. When passengers are judged by their appearance rather than their humanity, when federal law is ignored in favor of corporate convenience, when discrimination is enabled by silence and complicity, we all bear responsibility for the consequences. The hearing room was silent as she concluded. This case proves that individual courage and federal oversight can create change. But lasting reform requires commitment from industry leaders, elected officials, and passengers themselves. We cannot allow prejudice to fly under the radar any longer. The congressional hearings resulted in the Aviation Civil Rights Act legislation that strengthened federal oversight of airline discrimination, increased penalties for violations, and created new reporting requirements for complaints and resolutions. Multiple state attorneys general announced their own investigations into airline practices within their jurisdictions. Consumer advocacy groups filed class action lawsuits on behalf of passengers who had experienced discrimination but had never reported it. The legal and regulatory response sent a clear message throughout the aviation industry: the days of tolerating discrimination were over. Airlines that failed to ensure equal treatment for all passengers would face federal prosecution, massive financial penalties, and potentially the loss of their operating certificates. As Victoria Hayes was led away to begin her federal prison sentence, she had become a symbol of accountability and consequence. Her 18 years of discriminating against passengers had ended with 18 months in federal prison and a lifetime ban from the industry she had once dominated. The woman she had tried to humiliate and remove from her aircraft had not only survived the attack, but had used her federal authority to transform an entire industry. Justice had been served. Accountability had been established, and the message had been sent. Discrimination would no longer fly in America's skies. The transformation that followed the Flight 447 incident extended far beyond courtrooms and corporate boardrooms. It reached into the daily lives of millions of travelers, the training programs of major airlines, and the consciousness of a nation grappling with questions of equality and justice. 6 months after Victoria Hayes began serving her federal prison sentence, the changes were visible throughout the aviation industry. Airports that had once been sites of routine discrimination had become showcases for inclusive service and respectful treatment of all passengers. At Hartsfield Airport, where the incident had occurred, a new civil rights compliance office had been established to handle discrimination complaints and monitor airline behavior. The office was staffed by federal investigators with the authority to conduct immediate investigations and impose sanctions for violations. The changes were most dramatic at Skyline Airways itself. Under federal oversight, the airline had implemented the most comprehensive anti-discrimination training program in industry history. Every employee, from baggage handlers to senior executives, was required to complete 40 hours of civil rights education annually. The training wasn't generic corporate sensitivity workshops. It was real-world preparation for recognizing and preventing discrimination, developed in partnership with civil rights organizations and based on actual incidents from the federal investigation. Flight attendants now trained in scenarios specifically designed to challenge their assumptions about passengers. They learned to recognize their own biases, to question their initial judgments, and to treat every passenger with equal dignity regardless of appearance, age, or race. Gate agents underwent extensive education about fraud detection versus racial profiling, learning to verify tickets through proper channels rather than making assumptions based on passenger appearance. The visual verification that had led to Victoria's downfall was now explicitly prohibited throughout the industry. Perhaps most significantly, airlines implemented robust reporting systems that encouraged passengers to document discrimination and assured them of thorough investigation and meaningful responses. The days of buried complaints and confidential settlements were over. The industry-wide changes were equally remarkable. Major airlines voluntarily adopted the training and compliance standards that had been mandated for Skyline Airways. Delta, United American, and Southwest all announced partnerships with civil rights organizations to review their practices and eliminate discriminatory policies. The results were measurable and immediate. Discrimination complaints across the industry dropped by 60% in the first year after the incident. Not because discrimination had disappeared, but because airline employees had been educated about their obligations, and passengers felt more confident that their complaints would be taken seriously. Customer satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements in minority passengers' perceptions of airline service. For the first time in decades, Black, Hispanic, and Asian travelers reported feeling as welcomed and respected as white passengers when flying. The personal transformations were equally significant. Carlos Rivera, the co-pilot who had witnessed Victoria's discrimination but failed to report it, became a vocal advocate for workplace accountability. He led workshops for aviation professionals about the importance of speaking up when witnessing discrimination. "I was a coward," Rivera said during one such workshop. "I saw discrimination happening, and I stayed silent because I didn't want to create conflict with my crew." That silence enabled Victoria Hayes to continue hurting passengers for years. "Never again will I choose comfort over conscience." David Thompson, the business executive who had eventually spoken up during the Flight 447 incident, started a consulting firm dedicated to helping companies identify and eliminate discriminatory practices. His experience witnessing real-time discrimination and its consequences had transformed him from a passive observer to an active advocate for change. Sarah Martinez leveraged her viral documentation of the incident into a career as a civil rights journalist. Her investigative reporting on discrimination in travel and hospitality had won national awards and led to additional federal investigations of hotels, car rental agencies, and tourism companies. The Flight 447 incident showed me that ordinary people can become agents of change when they have the courage to document injustice and amplify the voices of those being discriminated against, Martinez explained in a speech to journalism students. "Sometimes the most important story of your career is happening right in front of you." The passengers who had witnessed the incident became part of a network of travelers committed to reporting discrimination and supporting victims. They formed an organization called Fair Skies that monitored airline behavior and provided legal support for passengers facing discrimination. Even some of Skyline Airways' former employees found redemption through the transformation process. Jennifer Walsh, after serving her federal sentence, became an educator for the Anti-Defamation League, sharing her story about how workplace culture can enable discrimination and the importance of individual moral courage. I enabled Victoria Hayes for years because I was afraid of conflict, afraid of being labeled a troublemaker, afraid of losing my job. Walsh testified at congressional hearings on workplace accountability. But my silence made me complicit in every passenger who was humiliated, every person who was made to feel less than human. Fear cannot be an excuse for enabling injustice. The most profound transformation was in the federal oversight of civil rights in aviation. Inspector Amara Collins had been promoted to head a new FAA Civil Rights Division, with expanded authority to investigate discrimination across all modes of transportation. Under her leadership, the division conducted surprise inspections of airline training programs, reviewed complaint data in real time, and worked with passenger advocacy groups to identify emerging patterns of discrimination. The division's annual reports became required reading for airline executives and civil rights advocates alike. The Flight 447 incident was a turning point, Collins explained in an interview with 60 Minutes. It showed that federal oversight combined with public accountability can create real lasting change. But transformation requires constant vigilance. Discrimination doesn't disappear overnight. It has to be actively prevented through education, enforcement, and cultural change. The broader cultural impact was equally significant. The incident had become a case study in business schools, law schools, and civil rights programs. Students learned about the consequences of unchecked bias, the importance of institutional accountability, and the power of individual courage in confronting injustice. The viral nature of the original incident had created a permanent record of what discrimination looked like in the modern era. Unlike past cases of civil rights violations that were documented only in court records, the Flight 447 incident was preserved in high-definition video that would educate future generations about the reality of bias and the necessity of confronting it. Museums dedicated to civil rights history added exhibits about the incident, placing it in the context of the long struggle for equality in American transportation. From the Montgomery bus boycott to the Freedom Rides to Flight 447, the exhibit showed how each generation had to fight anew for the simple right to travel with dignity. The transformation was not complete, and discrimination had not been eliminated entirely. But the changes that followed Inspector Amara Collins' quiet courage on a Tuesday morning in Atlanta had created a foundation for continued progress. An industry that had once tolerated discrimination as an unfortunate but inevitable aspect of customer service had been forced to confront the reality that bias was not just morally wrong, but legally actionable and economically devastating. The quiet woman in seat 2B had not just exposed individual prejudice. She had catalyzed a transformation that would protect millions of travelers for generations to come. 18 months after Victoria Hayes was led away in handcuffs, Amara Collins found herself back at Hartsfield Airport, standing at the same gate where her life and career had been forever changed. But this time, she wasn't traveling undercover as part of an investigation. She was there to deliver the keynote address at the first annual Aviation Civil Rights Conference, an event that had grown out of the reforms sparked by her courage on Flight 447. As she walked through the terminal, Amara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scared young woman who had once been told she didn't look like pilot material had become the federal inspector who transformed an entire industry. The quiet passenger in seat 2B had found her voice and used it to speak for millions of travelers who had suffered in silence. The conference was being held in the very terminal where the incident had occurred, a symbolic choice that emphasized how far the aviation industry had come. Delegates from airlines around the world had gathered to share best practices, discuss ongoing challenges, and commit to continued progress in civil rights. In the main conference hall, Amara looked out at an audience that included airline executives, Federal investigators, civil rights advocates, and many of the passengers who had witnessed the original incident. Sarah Martinez was there now, an established civil rights journalist. David Thompson had flown in from Seattle, where his consulting firm was helping companies eliminate discriminatory practices. Carlos Rivera sat in the front row wearing the captain's stripes he had earned after his promotion following his testimony against discrimination. But the most moving presence was that of Victoria Hayes's former victims' passengers, who had suffered through years of discrimination but had never had a platform to share their stories until the Flight 447 incident gave them a voice. As Amara approached the podium, she thought about her grandmother who had passed away just months before the incident. Her grandmother had grown up in an era when black travelers faced legal segregation when they couldn't eat in airport restaurants or use the same restrooms as white passengers. She had lived to see the legal barriers fall, but she had also witnessed the more subtle forms of discrimination that persisted in the supposedly post-civil rights era. My grandmother used to tell me that every generation has to fight for dignity in their own way. Amara began, her voice carrying clearly through the conference hall. She fought against legal segregation. My parents fought against institutional barriers. Our generation fights against the kind of bias that hides behind policies and procedures that discriminates with a smile and a corporate explanation. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. The incident on Flight 447 was not about one bad flight attendant or one problematic airline. It was about a culture that had learned to hide discrimination behind the language of customer service security concerns and operational necessity. When Victoria Hayes tore up my boarding pass, she wasn't just attacking my right to travel. She was attacking the principle that all Americans deserve equal treatment, regardless of how they look or where they come from. Amara paused, looking directly at several airline executives in the audience. But the real victory wasn't Victoria Hayes going to prison. The real victory was the transformation that followed the recognition that discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's operationally destructive and legally actionable. When airlines started treating civil rights as seriously as safety regulations, everybody benefited. She gestured toward the audience. Look around this room. A year and a half ago, most of you would never have attended a conference on aviation civil rights because you didn't think it was necessary. You thought discrimination was either a problem of the past or isolated incidents that didn't require comprehensive response. The Flight 447 incident proved otherwise. The applause was sustained and heartfelt, but Amara wasn't finished. I want to be clear about something. I was not heroic on Flight 447. I was a federal inspector doing my job. The heroism came from the passengers who spoke up when they saw discrimination happening. It came from the crew members who chose truth over loyalty when they testified about patterns of bias. It came from the executives who chose real change over cosmetic reforms. She looked directly at David Thompson. It came from passengers like David Thompson, who could have stayed silent in his first-class seat, but chose to speak up for justice. It came from journalists like Sarah Martinez, who documented the incident and forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about discrimination. Amara's voice grew stronger as she approached her conclusion. The lesson of Flight 447 is not that federal inspectors can solve discrimination. The lesson is that ordinary people in ordinary moments have the power to choose between justice and comfort, between speaking up and staying silent, between enabling discrimination and ending it. She paused, remembering the moment when Victoria Hayes had torn her boarding pass in half, the moment when she had to decide whether to remain undercover or reveal her federal authority. When someone tells you that you don't belong somewhere, when someone treats you as less than human because of how you look, when someone tries to deny you the basic dignity that every person deserves, you have a choice. You can accept their judgment, or you can stand up and prove them wrong. The conference hall erupted in applause that lasted several minutes. As the audience rose to their feet, Amara saw tears in many eyes, tears of recognition, of validation, of hope for continued progress. In the days that followed the conference, airlines announced new initiatives. Civil rights organizations launched expanded monitoring programs, and passengers shared stories of improved treatment and respectful service. The transformation that had begun with one woman's quiet courage had rippled outward, touching millions of lives and creating a new standard for equality in American aviation. But for Amara Collins, the most meaningful moment came a week later, when she received a letter from a young black girl in Atlanta who had watched the Flight 447 video with her parents. "Dear Inspector Collins," the letter read, "My mom showed me the video of you on the airplane. She said you were brave and that you helped make flying safer for people like us. I want to be a pilot when I grow up, and now I know that people like me can be in charge of airplanes too. Thank you for showing me that I belong in first class and in the cockpit." Amara kept that letter on her desk as a reminder of why the work mattered, why standing up to discrimination was about more than individual justice. It was about creating a world where the next generation would never have to doubt their worth or their right to equal treatment. The quiet woman in seat 2B had not just reclaimed her own dignity. She had opened the skies for everyone who came after her, ensuring that the phrase "you don't belong here" would never again go unchallenged in American aviation. Sometimes courage looks like standing up in front of crowds and making speeches. Sometimes it looks like writing reports and filing federal charges. But sometimes courage looks like staying calm when someone tries to humiliate you, speaking quietly when others are shouting, and trusting that justice will prevail when you stand up for what's right. In a world where everyone has a camera and conscience matters, dignity isn't just a personal virtue. It's a force that can transform entire industries and create lasting change for generations to come. The story of Flight 447 lives on in training videos, civil rights curricula, and the transformed culture of American aviation. Inspector Amara Collins continues her work ensuring that every passenger can fly with dignity, knowing that her moment of quiet courage created ripples of justice that will last long after the cameras stop rolling.